Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you're all enjoying the conference today. This is my first LastCon, so excited to be here and speaking here today. So as mentioned, my talk is API security through external attack surface management. A little bit about my background. I work for CyCognito. I'm the hacker in residence. I was in product marketing, and I got recruited by the CSO to be the pen tester. So instead of a raise, I got an interesting title. So I've been an offensive security professional for a little over 10 years and cybersecurity coming up on 19 years. I'm also a former adjunct instructor. I taught at Dallas College for almost 4 years teaching pen testing and web app pen testing. And I'm the concept creator and co-author of the Pen Tester Blueprint, which was based on my experience teaching. So my first day of class lecture, telling my students how to become pen testers, what they needed to know to become a pen tester, ended up turning into a conference talk by November of 2018. And then it turned into, did the conference talk several times, but from being in the Tribe of Hackers Red Team book, Wylie Publishing asked me if I was interested in writing a book. And so I thought this would be a perfect subject to write on because, a lot of people trying to get in the industry don't have any idea how to become a pen tester, what prerequisite knowledge is needed, because there's tons of books out there on pen testing, a lot of really good books, but where to start is missing in most cases. And if you don't know someone in the industry, this knowledge was really lacking out there in the books. And so I'm also a podcast host of the Hacker Factory podcast, and I am a founder of a DEF CON group in Denton, Texas, DC 940, and I used to run a group called the Pwn School Project. And so the agenda, we're going to be discussing attack surface management, prioritizing the external portion of attack surface management. We're going to cover risky exposed services and protocols, risky IP exposures, discovering attack surfaces, API pen testing and tools, as well as addressing gaps with external attack surface management. So a little slide I like to share here, especially in case there's anyone in the room that's just getting started out. This is kind of my path into offensive security. So I graduated high school, didn't know what I wanted to do for a living, so I became a pro wrestler. So I did that for a few years, got married and had to have a more stable job with insurance and benefits. So I ended up going to a trade school and I became a CAD drafter. I learned AutoCAD. And through AutoCAD, I found out about sysadmin work. I was working for this one company and we're being billed out at $30 an hour. So we're making half of that. So someone that came in to work on our server was being billed at $50 an hour. I thought, this guy's making $10 an hour more than me, so I need to be doing what he's doing. It looks a lot more fun. So I taught myself how to build computers, took a Novell NetWare C&E certification course, and then got my first job on a NetWare 4.1.1 and Windows 95 rollout. And so about January 2004, I moved over to the information security team at my company. I'd had my eyes on moving into that role. In 2005, the company hired a CISO, and he had more of a modern idea of the way things were being done and kind of siloed us into different groups. And that's where I got put into the AppSec group, which led me into pen testing, from doing vulnerability scans and web application vulnerability scans and managing third-party pen tests. I found out about pen testing. And then in 2012, I got laid off from my job at the mortgage company and applied for a consulting role as a pen tester. And so I've spent 10 years in that role, and out of all the different areas of security, it's the one I've stayed in the longest. Before that was AppSec, which I think is AppSec. I was in for about 7 years, 6 or 7 years, something like that. And so during that time, this is a real bear. It's a 750-pound black bear, brown bear. I forget which one is the bigger of the two. And this was a match I did in Denton, Texas, an independent match that I did at the nightclub where I was a bouncer, the same place where I actually happened to wrestle this bear. Because if you kind of notice in the background, this little landscape or skyline, you can kind of see in the back. It's the same place. But so to kind of get into the talk now, and so attack surface management. To understand attack surface management, we must first define attack surface management. And according to NIST, it's this set of points on the boundary of a system element, or an environment where an attacker can try to enter, cause an effect on, or extract data from that system element, or an environment. And so basically, attack surface you can look at as the attack vectors in your environment. And so the importance of attack surface management it assesses security from the threat actor perspective. It is hard to assess and secure what you don't know about. Penetration testing once or twice a year is not enough. We need to be able to do something in between those times. Reoccurring vulnerability scans are not enough. Threat actors are constantly scanning the internet looking for vulnerabilities to exploit. So they're out there using tools like Shodan whenever the latest exploitable vulnerability is out there, or different vulnerabilities that are exposed through Shodan, trying to find these things. So they're constantly looking, so we need to be constantly vigilant. And so here's a kind of a little snippet from an article from CISA.gov, from their known exploited vulnerability PDF that they had out there. And this is just a clip of it because they were talking about several vulnerabilities out there that were being chained together to be able to exploit an environment. It wasn't like highly critical vulnerabilities. So to kind of read this paragraph, it says, also, many of the vulnerabilities classified as critical are highly complex and have never been seen exploited in the wild. In fact, only 4% of the total number of CVEs have been publicly exploited, but threat actors are extremely fast to exploit their vulnerabilities. A choice of those 4% known exploited CVEs, 42% are being used on day zero disclosure, 50% within 2 days, and 75% within 28 days. Meanwhile, the CVSS scores on some of these are medium or even low severity. They're chaining these together. So when you're remediating things, and I'll probably mention this throughout this, you look at things that are low or medium, someone figures out how to exploit it, then it becomes something that could be used later on to breach your company. And some cases here, they're talking about how even lows and mediums are being used. And that's even before someone coming out how to exploit some of these vulnerabilities. So attack surface management addresses both the internal and external facing systems. While both are important, our focus today is going to be in the external attack surface. And so this talk I originally gave for Alyssa Knight's API Secure conference that she put on back in April, and I was trying to come up with a topic, and one of the things I was seeing from where I was working and my experience in the industry is kind of the external attack surface management and where that's really needed to secure APIs. So elements of attack surface management, so if you really look at a lot of these are things that have been going on for a long time. A lot of cases, you were hearing of vulnerability management teams, they were handling a lot of the vulnerability scanning, penetration testers performing pen testers. So a lot of these elements have been out there for a while, but some of the terminology changes over the years, like attack surface management, attack surface reduction. So you see some of these different words being used, terminology for these different things. It's just kind of funny to look at the terminology and how it's changed over the years. Back in my sysadmin days, I remember how some cases were called network engineers, and we really weren't network engineers. It finally took a while before they started settling on system engineer or sysadmin. And so the same thing happens with different areas in the industry, like vulnerability management, threat and vulnerability management, but the attack surface management is kind of the new buzzword, and the external attack surface management is on one of Gartner's area points on their quadrants now. So it's drawing a lot of attention. You go to a lot of conferences and you see a lot of focus on that. A lot of people are moving from just vulnerability scanning to add other features to try to address those external attack surface management needs. So kind of the elements: vulnerability scanning, vulnerability assessment, and penetration testing. Red teaming, also known as adversary emulation. And when we talk about red teaming here, I'm talking about the true term where you're doing adversary emulation. Wirefall that's in the room has one of the best definitions I've seen, is the red team tests the blue team. So it's more than just looking for vulnerabilities. So you're not going to go out there and just try to do a red team operation against a company. It's funny that I worked for a company once, and it was ridiculous. I had this director that we needed to have some pen tests done against our SAP systems, and he was wanting to have a red team operation done against SAP systems. So the terminology is just funny how it gets misunderstood sometimes. So purple teaming is something that's come along that's been very helpful in improving the security postures of organizations, because if you wait for all the times it takes to get through your pen test, vulnerability scans, do the remediation, those cycles could lead up to months or years. And with purple teaming, you're able to come in and take some of the tools out of the hands of attackers by performing these red team operations, executing tools, say they're detected, tuning your systems to be able to detect against that, disabling dangerous type of tools from being executed by end users and so forth. And bug bounties is another opportunity that's come along that's been helpful for external attack surface management. And also your application security and testing integrated into your software development life cycle instead of waiting until the end to fix the bugs. Start trying to take care of the bugs as things are development. Some cases things are already out there and you have to kind of pen test later on, but this is something to keep in mind. So traditional attack surface management gaps. So one of the things that compliance-based pen testing did was it brought about the need for pen testing. Based on my experience when I got in 2012, I saw how compliance-based pen testing like PCI DSS drove a lot of pen testing. And while that was good and brought attention, a lot of cases what happened was people were spending all their funds on PCI testing and environments were being missed that should have been in scope for the pen test. Because someone could go in and breach one of your non-PCI environments and get access to critical data, PII, health records, and all sorts of things regardless. And the attackers don't care if you're compliant or not. They're going to get in regardless, if you're not doing everything that you need to be, making sure to secure your environment, not just try to check the box for compliance. And so through this, the narrow scope, so the missing testing types, pen testers are assigned the scope of this pen test, and this is no fault of their own. You got 1,000 IP addresses, they're testing those. And one of the things I've kind of seen over the years is the skill set when it comes to OSINT. A lot of times OSINT's been missing. You got a certain number of IP addresses, you're doing your Nmap scans, doing some reconnaissance, but you're not using OSINT tools that could uncover some other hosts that are in scope that are totally being missed, that are vulnerable. An example was back several years ago, I was doing a black box pen test from the internet. We only knew the physical location of the company because we were also testing physical security. But one of the things I did, I went through, looked for all the network blocks, got all my IP addresses, domains, and subdomains. But one of the things I noticed from doing OSINT, I found an FTP server in Indonesia that we had no record of in those network blocks. So this is a clear text FTP server out there on the internet that got missed. If I had done the OSINT, it would have got missed. So this just kind of goes, we'll get into some of the details about asset inventories here in a minute, but this kind of is one of the reasons why you want to do that, the narrow scope, missing those things out. So systems and whole environments get missed out. Time and resource limitations. So if you're focusing all your time on compliance-based pen testing, you're not getting around to everything that you need to get tested. And if you're, sometimes budgets are limited, so you don't have that much time for consulting. You have your own internal resources, but resources are spread thin. And then incomplete and inaccurate asset inventories, just going back to that, discovering that FTP server through OSINT. And so like I said, we're prioritizing the external attack surface. And one of the reasons to do that, internal is a risk. Even looking at your Wi-Fi connectivity, someone from the outside could hack in through your Wi-Fi. But the thing about your external attack surface exposed to the internet, anyone from anywhere around the world can attack you. So there's a lot more traffic, a lot more attempts. Anyone that's ever managed a web server or had their own web server monitoring the logins to see how many failed attempts from people trying to get in, and you just figure your website that's not getting that much visibility, what's going to happen if you're a bank or some Fortune 500 company that are constantly being attacked. So there's a lot more opportunity and a lot more attractiveness for an attacker to try to target these organizations, and a lot more easier to attack those organizations. So risky exposed services and protocols, while the main focus is APIs, it's worth mentioning that exposures of RDP, different Microsoft protocols, SMB protocols on Unix and Linux systems, clear text protocols like HTTP or FTP and Telnet are dangerous to expose the internet. So we really, with this, what we're discussing here with external attack surface management, we're also covering the different exposed data as well as APIs and stuff. You want to manage what's being exposed to the internet. So risky API exposure. So most cases at conference, I kind of mention this stuff because it's typically conferences with people that are in other areas of security or IT But basically, API API stands for Application Programming Interface. A web API is an application programming interface for the web. A browser API can extend the functionality of a web browser. A server API can extend the functionality of a web server. So this is a reference from w3schools.com, just to kind of lay a little groundwork on what APIs are. And risky API exposures. So insecure APIs are of course a risk, especially when it's unintentionally exposed to the internet. Even the ones that are intentionally exposed. There's sometimes you have APIs internally that you don't want exposed to the internet, and you need to make sure that those are not being leaked out. So addressing external attack surface management gaps. So you need to make sure you're doing some external attack surface management discovery, helping define that external attack surface. And then reconnaissance, including OSINT. Like I mentioned before, I think this is one area that a lot of pen testers could work more on, because the narrow scopes, people aren't getting that much skill in. So it's definitely one of those areas, because you see some people specializing in OSINT. So making sure to spend time in these areas to detect things you might not otherwise, just from scanning a set number of APIs or just a specific subnet. And so during your discovery, you're going to collect known IP addresses, the IP subnets, domain names, as well as subdomains, and then you're going to do your reconnaissance against those targets. So during this reconnaissance, we're going to do our collection of IP addresses using the autonomous system numbers, also using ARIN and RIPE, your regional registrars, to get those IP blocks. Subdomain enumeration using tools like Subfinder and OWASP AMAS to make sure you find those subdomains. Because one of the interesting things about this slide here is this was a reference from Jason Haddock's bug hunter methodology. And it's interesting because this methodology was originally developed to show how to hunt for bugs through bug bounties. But there was so much stuff in the reconnaissance, the presentations typically just covered the reconnaissance piece, but there's a lot of good information there. One of the things that bug hunters will find is if the ones that dig really deep may find certain kind of bugs, but the ones that are going wide, going out looking for different resources, really doing their OSINT, are able to uncover some things. So using tools like Shodan, like I mentioned, Crunchbase for mergers and acquisitions data, collecting that business data that you may find information on. If you can find Wikipedia articles on that company, you can find some of the mergers information. And on YouTube, Jason Haddock has several versions of this talk, but it's really good. That's actually one of the reasons or ways I even found bug bounties to improve my web app pen testing skills, from following some of the people on the bug bounty scene. Because one of the things with bug bounties, you're only getting paid if you find something. As pen testers, we get paid regardless. So those guys are going to have to work a lot harder if they want to make money at it. And so it's kind of one of the comparisons I like to make is, if you're a hunter for fun and pleasure, you're not probably going to catch as much as someone that has that their life depends on it. If you're having to hunt for food, you're going to be a lot better hunter than someone that's just doing it for fun. And this is kind of the same thing with bug bounties. So these people come out with different unique ways of finding things. Some of them specialize in certain bugs, but some of the things that I've seen in that, I've seen where the correlation between that and external attack surface management, where these type of techniques help. And one of the things that actually kind of drew me to the company where I'm at, looking at some of the things I saw from pen testing, looking at some of the things from the bug bounty world and what they were doing here. So the reconnaissance scanning, so you're going to scan the IP addresses, domains, and subdomains, using tools like Nmap to scan for live hosts. And then you're going to use Nmap to scan for ports and services. And since the focus of this is on APIs, we're going to be looking for web services, although those other resources are important, but the focus of this talk is APIs. So you're going to look for web services so we can find where those APIs could be located. So API endpoint discovery. So API enumeration tools like Kite Runner for RESTful API discovery, FFoof for word list-based API discovery. And this was referenced from Katie Paxton Fear, also known as Insider PhD, another bug bounty person, that she's got this really good video on YouTube on API pen testing. So it's titled My API Testing Automated Toolbox. And so this is a really good resource. And so API vulnerability testing, also from Katie's video, So different API testing tools, Authorize, which is a Burp Suite extension for detecting IDORs, Log++ for multi-threading logging extension for Burp Suite, and SQL Map for SQL injection testing, and then NoSQL Map for NoSQL type testing for testing those types of databases, and JW Tool for JavaScript web token testing, and also Burp Suite, the interception proxy and vulnerability testing tool for testing those endpoints. So if most of you have been seeing some of the talks today around API, you can see a lot of the overlaps and some really good resources that were shared today. So hopefully you got to see Matt's talk, and then earlier there was a good talk on detecting hacking APIs in 15 minutes. So API vulnerability testing. So API vulnerability testing tools, and this is leveraging OWASP ZAP. So they have an add-on for OpenAPI, GraphQL, and SOAP. And also you can import file. There's an add-on for importing files containing the URLs with these APIs. And so the references here from ZAP's website shows how to use ZAP to scan APIs, as well as another article there from 2017 on scanning APIs with ZAP. One of the things that's really nice about APIs now is all the resources we have compared to several years ago, because one of the first API pen tests I did was probably back in 2015 or so, and there just weren't nearly the tools out there. And so with all these resources and books out recently, it's made it a lot easier to learn how to pick up these skills. And so API vulnerability testing using the OWASP API projects, of course, and which I'm sure most of you are all familiar with this project. And some of the tools that did mention in there is using like Postman during your pen tests, and as well as there's like tools like SOAP UI that have been used. I think one of the commercial versions actually scans for vulnerabilities. Before, in the past, I would use SOAP UI and proxy it through Burp Suite or ZAP to look for vulnerabilities. But if you have the commercial version, which last time I checked, it really wasn't that expensive for a API vulnerability testing tool. And so addressing gaps with external attack surface management. So you're wanting to make sure that you're constantly discovering your attack surface. So achieve and maintain a more accurate asset inventory with companies constantly spinning up infrastructure and applications all the time. Shadow IT is even easier now, and our attack surface is constantly changing. You know, some marketing departments may run microservices to run some ad campaigns, and they don't take those down. Another example too is I had a friend that was performing a pen test against a university. All of their application development students had a website they developed apps on. And so all these sites were being built over the years, not taken down, not being patched, not being pen tested, leaving these vulnerabilities out there hanging. And so they had the college finally got around to doing a pen test to detect all these so they could take them down and out of production since they weren't being patched. And basically vulnerabilities just laying there, waiting to be breached. And so continuous testing, so making sure that you're constantly vulnerability scanning, pen testing, using external attack surface management platforms. Some organizations are offering continuous pen testing. That way you've got something going on in between your cycles. Because with some companies, it's like maybe one pen test a year, maybe a retest, maybe twice a year. And so there's all that time in between. One pen test I performed back years ago, while I was consulting, I did the test in January. The vulnerability we found was like a low-level vulnerability. 90 days later, went back to retest. Someone figured out how to exploit it. So if they hadn't had a retest done, that vulnerability would have been out there vulnerable to exploitation. So we need to keep those, to be serious with that. And I know I'm probably preaching the choir here when we try to get people to remediate and not file risk acceptance or expect to use their cyber insurance to take care of it, which is kind of a lame excuse for not fixing things sometimes. So the continuous testing. Automation, so to be able to scale what you're doing, automation is very helpful. It improves scalability and resource limitations. It improves consistency. So some of your redundant tasks, if you're a pen tester, if you can automate some of the things you're doing, then you can make your life easier and spend more time on the fun things besides just trying to validate SSL and TLS related findings. That is like the worst thing for pen testers to have to do those. And also remediation, timely and complete remediation. And so some references that I have here, Corey Ball's book, Hacking APIs, is a really good book. And he also recently released some training on university.apisec. It's an API, actually they have an API certification for it. It's got all the training on there. It's based on his book, so that's a really good resource for training. He originally released the training during DEF CON, like in a YouTube video series. He did something in the Red Team Village there, did some training, so that's available out there, a really good resource. And actually, this presentation, I did a article for US Cybersecurity Magazine, so if you're interested in that, it's got some of the resources listed in there, as well as I list on here the resources from Jason Haddix and Katie Paxton Fear. And so that concludes the presentation. We can open it up to questions if anyone has any questions. Sure.
So thanks for the talk. API security is super important. One of the things that confuses me though is, APIs, there's lots of open source libraries. But when people talk about API security, they don't include open source security as part of that discussion. I'm just wondering how do you see that? How would you think about testing it?
Yeah, I definitely think it should be part of the testing. And one of the things too I've seen is to have a process in place for testing your open source tools that you're using, and then even make sure you're validating, because just like Log4j, there were certain Java libraries that using those vulnerable libraries, but keeping track of that. I was talking to someone recently that they had a really good process set up that they were keeping the software bill of materials, that they kept track of all the things they did and track that. So it definitely needs to be tested and not ruled out, because open source, just like anything else, can be vulnerability, and some of those things lay out there forever before someone discovers it. The bad guys aren't going to let you know they found it until you've been breached on it, and hopefully the security researchers find it first so we can actually fix it.
Yeah, well, you didn't mention it, right? I'm just curious, why aren't people talking about that as a big part of API security?
Definitely, I agree.
It's just an oversight, in my opinion, but I don't understand what's going on.
Yeah.
What the hell, y'all?
That I think one of the things that's good about API security, I think we're at now where cloud was about 3 to 5 years ago. There's finally good resources. People see it's aware. So I think we're going in a direction the right way. But as you mentioned, the open source stuff, and I think we need to keep that in mind for anything software related, any tool we're using, open source, because it's good tools, but you just got to make sure that you're testing it and keeping up with the latest versions. And with some of the Log4j stuff you hear where people go in and build a new server and they didn't apply the patch and the vulnerability is still lingering and laying around out there.
Can I ask a more controversial question?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so let's see how to put this. So almost all new applications are APIs on the server side and browser apps and mobile apps and other kinds of clients on the client side. And it's been like that for quite a while. 5 years, 10 years maybe, I don't know. I started, like you mentioned when you tested your first API, I remember when I tested my first, it was like 2007.
Okay.
And I ran into an API-driven website and it blew up WebScare. Just demolished it because it was popping up, everything. So it is a challenge, but it's been a long time.
Yes.
And so I went through the OWASP API top 10 pretty carefully, side by side with the API top 10. And it looks to me like there shouldn't be two different top 10s. Most of the stuff in the API top 10 is like different versions of access control problems. Mm-hmm. And so they cut it, so there's like 6 access control ones in there, and then there's 4 others. If you take those 6 and map them into access control, then there's a bunch of gaps. And if you look at the other things in the OWASP top 10, they apply equally to APIs. Mm-hmm. Things like design issues and SSRF is an important one. But I'm wondering if you think it's really a separate space, or is it just application security and it doesn't need to be a separate category called API security?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't see anything wrong with having the separate categories. Make sure people keep in mind. But one of the things also I'll say too, when you're doing your testing, is the thing about the OWASP top 10. It's what is the current most common vulnerabilities. So we want to make sure we're using like the OWASP testing guide, using like the Web Application Hackers Handbook and testing for that, and not just based on that top 10 or whatever. Because even if you look at some of the bug bounty companies, a lot of them are using port swiggers, or they use used to be the Web Application Hackers Handbook, but since they put all that online now, using that as a testing guide along with OWASP testing guide too, instead of just basing off the top 10 or whatever.
I know your talk took an entirely external perspective on testing APIs. I'm curious what you think the role of tools like SAST and IAST are in the testing process here for APIs.
Yeah.
Do you think they're less effective or more effective, or how do you compare?
I think it's important to use, and also too, the focus was external, but the internal piece is important. And one of the things that maybe I didn't mention in the talk that maybe I should have too is we want to secure our internal APIs just in case that they were leaked. Have them just as secure.
Yeah, I think Zero Trust would say everything is publicly accessible, right?
Yeah.
So you got to secure more.
Yeah,
there is no internal and external.
Because you never can tell when someone's going to misconfigure a firewall or something, or you take some universities that have like, a whole publicly routable subnet, and something happens one day that you're able, I've seen some of these universities where they were publicly routable, and if you could get to it from the internet. And so cases like that, some large organizations back years ago that bought those subnets, and it could be internet routable, and if you're not blocking things in a firewall, then it's not good.
I'm sorry for dominating.
Oh, good questions though. Thanks for the interaction. Anyone else have questions or comments?
I always like to ask, what you tried that didn't work. What are things that I shouldn't try in looking at my attack surface management? Right? If you could save me some time, I'd love to hear it.
Man, I can't think of anything right offhand, but just one of the crazy things is like on our platform, PLCs shouldn't be exposed to the internet, but we've had customers where they've had PLCs exposed to the internet. So whatever water treatment facility or manufacturing facility, you could just go onto that page and click on something.
Just don't try that.
Yeah, don't try.
Take down the water.
Yeah.
I was curious what you think about APIs that don't consume HTTP, like back-end connections that consume, well, it's not back-end, it's really public, but like it's pulling messages off MQ or, from serverless functions, or, how do you go about testing those?
I'm not really an API expert, so I just really couldn't. Yeah. Anyone else?
Do you have any recommended tools?
Kite Runner. Yeah. Okay. And if anyone wants to,
Please answer it though.
oh yeah, well, as mentioned earlier, Kite Runner, Postman is a popular tool for that. And also too, another good resource on some API stuff is Alyssa Knight's content, because on her YouTube channel, she's done a lot of API pen testing, and she goes into leveraging like even mobile apps to get access to APIs through that. But the funny thing is, to go back old school, is people remember before APIs when we had like middleware servers. Remember Microsoft BizWorks? Nope. Thanks, everyone.